Hi everyone, this is a 10-minute video that will tell you about the information in Module 2. Make sure to take notes so that you can use them when you take your semester exam. Although the Middle Ages were considered a dark era, we know now that it was actually pretty exciting. People started to move from the cities back to farms. A really interesting system came about that we call manorialism. In this system, peasants who were the lowest in the social ladder farmed only a certain part of land in a big field shared by many other peasants. A huge part of the Middle Ages is something we call feudalism. It is basically a system of classifying people in a society. If you think of their society as a pyramid, we can start at the top. At the very top would be the king or the monarchy. Think of this as the principal of your high school. Right below the king would be the nobility and, for example, the assistant principal. The nobles had to pay taxes to the king and provide knights to help fight for the king. Right under the nobles would be the vassals and the knights, or in the case of your school, the teachers. At the very bottom of the period would be the peasants or the serfs. In terms of your school, they would be the students. The serfs were unique in that some were forced to stay and work the land, but some serfs were free and just rented the land. When it came to freeing yourself from the social connection, it was nearly impossible. Whatever you were born as, you pretty much stayed. However, there were a lot of young men who chose to become apprentices, where they would learn a trade such as being a carpenter, mastering wood, or a blacksmith working with metal. Men could also join the church to become a priest or a monk. Women, however, had very few rights and privileges during this time. Let's talk about the really awesome stuff, knights. Knights practice and tried to become a knight through a very long process. Once a man became a knight, he had to adhere to a code of chivalry. This means that he had to protect and respect the church and help the weak and the poor. At this time, Christianity was very popular in Europe. More specifically, it was the Catholic Church. The Pope had a lot of power, and the church really used its authority. People who belonged to the church were required to pay a tithe. People still do this today when they give money to the church, except now it's not required. Back then, all Christians had to donate 10% of their income to the church. So if you made $10,000 a year, which is just an example because that's a lot of money for back then you would give $1,000 to the church. The church also made a lot of money off of the Crusades. Eventually, Rome would start to crumble, thus so would the power of the Roman Empire. During this time, the Byzantine Empire was still growing strong in the east. Many Germanic tribes started to take over in the west. Here is where we see the power of one man named Charlemagne. Charlemagne was a military expert. The Vikings were his only threat, but he was extremely organized and was able to help convert the Vikings into Christians. He was also able to expand Christian influence, build schools, and encourage trade. This map shows us the expansion of the Roman Empire and shows the influx of invading forces. Let's talk about the influence of Christianity in Europe at this point. The church was extremely powerful. They built up Christianity in Europe and did everything they could to spread their religion elsewhere. They designed churches with a Gothic-style architecture, which is shown here. Christians at this point really had their hopes on gaining control of Jerusalem. If you remember back to Module 1, all three monotheistic religions began there, so a lot of them wanted control of it. This will start what we call the Crusades. There are going to be a total of 4 crusades and some sloppy crusades after that. There's an awesome set of graphics in Lesson 2.3 that talk about all 4 of the crusades. There's another interesting crusade called the Children's Crusade. No one ever reached the Holy Land, but there were children who thought they might try to go get the Holy Land back for Christians. Although the Crusades didn't really change much in the name of Christianity, it did expose Europe to new trade routes, luxuries, and those Islamic achievements that you learned about in Lesson 1.4 for Module 1. Another major change during the Middle Ages was something called the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. This was spread through trade routes from the fleas on rats. It was really gross. The plague killed about 1/4 of Europe's population, which means that about 1 in 4 people died from the plague. Although this was a dark time with many deaths, there were some positives such as the expansion of art and literature. If you've ever read Beowulf in your English class or seen the movie, this actually comes from the Middle Ages. Music during this time period was also called homophonic, meaning all voices sing together. Let's talk about economics. During the Middle Ages, the economy really started to develop. People were trading via the new routes discovered from the Crusades, and people started building up huge cities next to important ports near the water for easy trading. Medieval guilds came to be very popular as well. Medieval guilds are a group of people who join to help benefit one another. A club you might join at school, such as student government, is similar to a guild, where everyone is working together to help one another. All this money flowing started up a whole new group of people called merchants. They created goods to sell to earn a profit and usually started a guild. People realized that they should split up some of the work and let people focus on what they were good at in terms of making a final project complete and at a faster rate. Money lenders came about who would lend money to others but charge interest, where they earned money on the money they lent to someone until they got all of their money back. We even still have this today. Unfortunately, this is where a lot of anti-Semitism stems from. Most money lenders were Jewish because Christians were not allowed to charge interest because the church would not let them. So the Jewish people in these towns would be the money lenders, and people started to become angry at the amount of interest being charged. So, how did all of these towns look? Well, they're actually really cool. They had walls built up around them and always had a town square with a huge market for trading and buying. However, they quickly became overcrowded and very unsanitary. There were also a lot of castles. Have you ever heard of Marco Polo? And no, I don't mean the game that you play in the pool. I mean the famous European explorer. This is Marco Polo. He was really an amazing explorer. He traveled along the Silk Roads and ended up telling his story while he was captured and imprisoned in Genoa, a rival merchant town. His stories tell of his travels. This is why when you play this game in the pool, you're trying to capture someone else, because Marco Polo was actually captured himself. Towards the end of the High or Late Middle Ages, we see feudalism start to disappear, and we see the rise in the power of monarchs who are kings or queens. Because kings and queens became so powerful, a document called the Magna Carta ended up being written in England. This was a document that said that kings and queens had to obey laws as well. This also established the first parliament, which is a group of people who help the monarchy make laws and decisions. Be sure to scroll through lesson 2.6 because there is so much more information about the Magna Carta and the rise of nationalism in Europe. Alright, enough about Europe. Let's talk about Asia. Now, because Japan is an island, it wanted to be left alone. The major religion in Japan was Shintoism. Zen Buddhism would later become popular after Chinese influence encouraged them to try out this new religion. Haiku was also popular. During this time, China was not interested in foreign relations. They liked to keep to themselves. They practiced Buddhism and the teachings of Confucius and would not join the rest of the Europeans for many years later. Meanwhile, back in Japan, they had a type of government called bakufu. Bakufu is similar to a fief in medieval Europe. Basically, they had control over a manor. In Japan, during the Heian period, they too had a pyramid in their society. At the top was the emperor. As you can see in this pyramid, the emperor is at the top. However, they didn't really have much power. The power really was in the hands of the shogun. Below the shogun were the daimyo, similar to a European noble or vassal, and then the samurai, and at the bottom, the peasants, merchants, and farmers. Samurai were actually very, very honorable. Here is a picture of a samurai. Samurai, in fact, practice what we call the code of Bushido, which is very similar to the code of chivalry. They actually would also have to perform Bushido, which is a ritual suicide in just in case they might be killed by another warrior. They would have to stick a sword through their own stomach. Ouch. However, it's always about honor. Although medieval Japan had a strong military due to the Bakufus and their organized control of the samurai, the Japanese almost fell to the Mongols. Genghis Khan was a great warrior who was in control of the Mongol army, and he knew how to get the land that he wanted. The Japanese were also subject to European influence in Christianity. At first, the Europeans were welcomed, and shortly after, they were forbidden to convert into Christianity. Although Japan spent much time in an age of prosperity, its daimyos began to break Japan down. When the Tokugawa was able to take control, his focus was to return Japan to isolationism for hundreds of years and completely rid Japan of Christianity and European influence. Alright, well that is it for Module 2. Be sure to really review Lessons 2.8 and 2.9 as they help you to compare and contrast medieval Europe and medieval Japan. Call your teacher if you have any questions, and thank you so much for taking the